Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce my guests today, two guests, tell you about our sponsor. Most of you know about this already. For those of you who are listening to the podcast for the first time, it's the Great Courses Plus. They are one of my favorite online content providers. They provide, this is the teaching company, the Great Courses. They produce these college-level courses, hundreds and hundreds of them, at studios, so they're professionally done, high-quality sound and visuals. And with the app, you get a subscription model in which you can access, instead of buying a single course, you can access all of the courses. Like here's one, my favorites, Big Questions of Philosophy with my friend and colleague David K. Johnson. He's a professional philosopher. And this is some of the great questions you can ask, like how do we reason carefully? Why should we trust reason? What is truth? Is knowledge possible? When can we trust testimony? Is faith ever rational? Do our souls make us free? Well, that's a good one because that's the subject of today's podcast I'm going to introduce in a moment. To access the Great Courses Plus, you go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. That'll get you the 20% discount on the annual subscription rate, which comes out to about, I think it was $30 off a year plus a free trial. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. Check it out. All right, my guests today are two of them, Daniel C. Dennett and Gregg D. Caruso. Just Desserts, Debating Free Will, and that's what we do for the next 2 hours. This is an interesting conversation because although both are highly regarded and respected professional philosophers, you'll see a distinct difference. Dan's trafficking very much in the real world with lots of real-world examples of free will determinism, crime, punishment, just desserts, and so on. Gregg is very much sticking to the way he thinks and writes as a professional philosopher, that is carefully defining his terms and then moving out from there. And so that much of the tension you'll see, I think, between the two different positions is very much dependent on what you mean by these particular words and then how those words cash out in the real world with examples. So we pretty much cover everything there is to conceivably cover on this topic, although there's a lot more in the book. So if you're really into this, this is the best volume I've encountered so far, kind of summarizing all the different positions you can take on this issue. So with that, I give you Dan Dennett and Gregg Caruso. Thanks for coming on the show. My first debate I will have hosted on this podcast. I've had double guests, but never a formal debate. The book is Just Desserts, to give it a proper introduction here, Debating Free Will. And it's the best volume I've read yet on the subject that kind of captures everything. Dan, you always talk about steel manning the other guy's position. Well, we have the steel man right here, so it's a perfect way to, I think, address these deep issues. As I told you, I wanted to start off with just quoting this survey and then say why I'm quoting it, of which you're both familiar with. A 2009 survey asked 3,226 philosophy professors and grad students to weigh in on 30 different subjects of concern in their field, from a priori knowledge, aesthetic value, and God, to knowledge, mind, and moral realism. I'll include a link to this survey in the write-up here. On the topic of free will, quote, free will, compatibilism, libertarianism, or no free will, the survey found the following results. Accept or lean toward compatibilism, 59.1%. Accept or lean toward libertarianism, I guess that'd be true free will or something like that, 13.7%. Accept or lean to no free will, 12.2%, and then other, almost 15%. And the reason I quote this, on the one hand, it doesn't make any difference because, as Einstein said in response to that book that was published in his time, 100 Scientists Against Einstein, he said, why 100? One would do it if I'm wrong. But the reason I like this survey is because I like to think about the history and philosophy of science. And so maybe this doesn't apply here. But in science, usually there's a community of experts studying a particular problem eventually come to some consensus. Climate change, 97% of climate scientists think that climate change is human caused and so forth. But this would be like if we were still debating the Big Bang theory versus the steady state theory, and after 70 years, it's still not clear which is the right one, and cosmologists are still split. As an outsider, I would think, well, there's something wrong here. Either the problem is incredibly hard or else they've just conceiving it conceptually wrong and are running the wrong experiments. But maybe that doesn't apply to philosophy. Why, after 2,500 years, are we still debating free will and determinism? I'll let either of you jump in there.
Well, I think philosophy got off on the wrong foot several thousand years ago when Socrates and Plato convinced people that they should look for essential properties and try to, Euclidify philosophy. Geometry was the obvious candidate for the most wonderful and perfect science there was, and the idea was to make philosophy as much like geometry as possible. And that just turns out to be a big mistake. In the real world, outside of the world of mathematics, there just aren't very many bright lines, clear edges, definitions that will stand the test of counterexamples. And philosophers for several thousand years have spent way too much time fighting over definitions and being counterexample mongers when they should take a deep breath, adopt population thinking as derived from Darwin, and recognize that this process of strict definition and proof, which is, for many philosophers, it's just what philosophy is in almost every area doomed. And they should just recognize that and revise their practice.
I mean, I guess I would add, part of it is I think that this is one of those big perennial problems, and the fact that we're still debating it after 2,000 years, I do think reflects its philosophical and practical importance. I think one of the things Dan and I share is the fact that the way that we conceive of free will is intimately connected. In fact, I interdefine it with issues of moral responsibility. And so it touches every aspect of our daily lives. I mean, what you think about free will is going to impact what you think about interpersonal relationships, certain types of moral practices, what you might think of certain types of legal practices. I think one of the things that makes the free will problem hard is that it sort of touches on or crosses over a number of different areas of philosophy and subfields of philosophy. So some people conceive of it as a purely metaphysical problem, a problem about whether or not determinism is true. And in that case, I would agree with you. Wouldn't we have some consensus at this point as to the way the fundamental nature of reality is shaped? But some people view the problem of free will as a kind of ethical or moral problem, a problem about whether it justifies various kinds of moral practices like praise and blame and certain types of legal practices and retributivism and resentment and things like that. Some people view it as a kind of social political problem because it affects social and political policies, particularly legal policies. And some people view it as a kind of existential problem, like can we have meaning and purpose in life in a universe guided by immutable, unchanging laws of nature? But I would add on top of that at least, and I think maybe Dan shares this, is that I don't think this is a sort of scientific problem. That is, I don't think it's going to be solved scientifically. There are aspects of the problem that have empirical constraints. They're libertarian claims about, indeterminacies percolating up to the right level of neural networks. Well, that's an empirical question, right? And we could perhaps find an empirical solution to that, problem. But it's particularly, I think, in the way that Dan and I approach it in the book. The problem is really a philosophical one in how you define free will, but also how you define concepts like desert, what you take to be the most relevant and salient kind of notion of moral responsibility, how you see the relationship between those things. The only thing that shocks me on that survey is the percentage of professional philosophers still believe in libertarian free will.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certain naturalistic versions of libertarianism, and I would hope the majority of the professional philosophers are maybe adopting those. But I do think there has been some progress. I mean, for one thing, I don't think really many people in the philosophical community take it seriously that we have soul control or some kind of a gentle libertarian agent causal control over our actions where were some sort of unique non-physical substances capable of causing various, physical events. So I do think progress has been made. And I think particularly in the last 50 years or so, there's been a number of really important distinctions and additions, I think, philosophically, that have helped clarify which parts of the debate we should be focusing on and what kinds of distinctions are relevant. So I just think that's how philosophy moves. It moves slowly, and there's room for disagreement, especially when you're doing some form of conceptual analysis.
So just to be clear, both of you reject. Oh, sorry, Dan.
I would just add to that you do have to consider that a lot of philosophers just have hobby horses that they want to ride because they know how to ride them. And even though the views that they're maintaining are not about anything that anybody should care about, they can get a small coterie of philosophers to care about them. And so they have great fun batting definitions and proofs back and forth. I've become less and less patient with that over the many years of my career, and I'm ready to call it out when I see it. I think libertarianism is a great case. There's nothing good to be said about libertarianism. Nobody's ever offered a coherent model of a libertarian free will, and it just flies in the face of everything that we've learned about physics and biology and the way people are put together. It's an embarrassment.
Just to be clear, Dan. You mean there's no soul, there's no ghost in the machine, there's no soul, there's no mini me up here calling the shots, and because mini me would need a mini me inside mini me and ad infinitum.
So forth, yes. I mean, some people like playing with that, but I'm tired of it.
Yeah, and just to also be clear, because you debunked this, I think back in the 90s. Quantum randomness and that kind of chanciness to life, that also doesn't give you free will.
Yeah, for a very simple reason. Yeah, we do need the randomness of coin flips and dice throwing and that kind of randomness. We need that. We do. You can't be a robust and resilient and autonomous agent if you can't keep your future to some degree uncertain and unknowable by other agents. But that's not. Coin flips are a great example of a random phenomenon, except they're not quantum random and they don't have to be. So quantum physics doesn't get you anything that you can't get with coin flips. So we've already got coin flips, unproblematic. They're just as determined as dice throws and just as uncontrollable. The issue is control, not causation.
Oh, okay. That's a good distinction.
I would just add, I would just add that maybe I'm a little bit more patient with libertarian accounts just because I don't have the status Dan has to sort of just dismiss them. But I do think that there have been some recent, improvements in terms of libertarian accounts. Robert Kane and Mark Balaguer and, Erica. There's been some, Dan shaking his head. There's been some improvement, but I would agree with Dan that for me, the reason, so there's two different types of libertarian accounts. You should, sort of separate them. But the kind that just introduces indeterminacy at the level of physical events, I think for me, the real problem there is that the agent lacks the ability to settle which outcome ultimately occurs. That is, even if you place the indeterminacy at a very philosophically strategic moment in deliberation. So there are these really sophisticated accounts that say, like, well, when I'm deliberating a really difficult choice, I'm torn, and there's this phenomenological, that is a felt sense of indeterminacy, and that felt sense of indeterminacy corresponds to some real indeterminacy, and it percolates up to the level of neural networks, and I have reasons supporting either outcome. And as long as whichever outcome I do, it's reason backing. That is, I have reasons backing that choice, and therefore it makes it rational. and we should be held morally responsible. I mean, that's an improvement over Lucretian swerve, but maybe only marginally an improvement, because I think that the idea is that the agent may have reasons for having performed that action, but they can't settle which set of actions occur. Like if God rewound the tape, if there's true indeterminacy involved, you would just get this probabilistic distribution of outcomes each time. And it seems like the agent simply lacks the control and action necessary, I think, for me, to hold them morally responsible in the relevant sense, if it's just some indeterminacy. Plus, again, empirical constraints. These accounts are assuming a whole bunch of scientific things that have very little support, like quantum indeterminacies can exist at the appropriate level of brain activity and all of that. So I think there's very little reason to be hopeful for those kind of accounts.
Dan, you wanted to say something?
You wanted to?
Well, I was going to say, Gregg, your opening comments made me think of kind of a pragmatic approach, pragmatism approach to the issue. That one of my heroes and mentors was Martin Gardner, who was one of the founders of the modern skeptical movement, columnist for Scientific American forever. And he, even though he was a skeptic, he was not an atheist, and he made an argument that he called fideism, that he said he got from Miguel Unamuno and William James, that if you have an issue that cannot be resolved, ultimately, either through reason or empiricism, you can make a leap of faith, as it were, just kind of a pragmatic, it works for me. So Martin used to say, this would drive atheists crazy, I believe in God, even though I think atheists have better arguments than the theists have, and in immortality, and then the third one was free will. He said, I know the determinists have really good arguments, but I feel free, it works for me, it makes my life better to assume I'm making volitional choices. So Gregg, scaling up to society level, would you make the argument that even if we can't settle this issue in a debate like this, it's better if we assume determinism for prison reform, for the rehabilitation of criminals and things like that? It has a practical outcome, which one you choose, even though maybe you personally feel like you make free choices. So you assume I'm free and everyone else is determined, but society-wise, we should assume determinism because it's better for a practical outcome.
So assume determinism or assume free will?
Well, either way, for you personally, maybe freedom.
I guess I'd say a couple of things here. First, I think we should state our views. So I'm a free will skeptic. Dan's a compatibilist. And so my free will skepticism, I define as the thesis that who we are and what we do is sort of ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. And because of that, we're never morally responsible in a very particular and pervasive sense, which I call the basic desert sense. Dan disagrees that that's the relevant sense, but so that's my thesis. What I would say in response to the kind of pragmatic argument, because I've seen similar pragmatic arguments recently for libertarian free will. John Lemos has a book right now that actually makes exactly that kind of pragmatic argument for why we should assume some form of libertarian free will, even if it's a mystery. Peter Van Inwagen sort of has this view too, that, free will is a mystery. There's no way of really making sense of libertarian free will, but we must have it because otherwise morality would crumble. So I would say a couple of things. Like one, I don't think that the assumption is about determinism here or whether that's true or not, because Dan thinks determinism is true and free will still exists. And I would say free will doesn't exist whether or not determinism is true. That is, whether or not the universe is deterministic or indeterministic, we lack free will. But I do have an argument. Now, this is getting deep into our disagreement, I think, the disagreement between Dan and I, on the practical value of preserving the belief in free will. I have another book coming out called Rejecting Retributivism, and I've run an argument in that book against legal punishment that's predicated on the idea that individuals have free will. And the argument is called the Epistemic Argument, and it runs something like this. If you're going to intentionally impose harm on individuals, you have to have good prima facie justification for thinking that individual justly deserves to be intentionally harmed. If you lack, sufficient warrant to think that individual has that kind of free will and moral responsibility, then it'd be prima facie morally wrong to intentionally harm them. But the justifications of legal punishment, or even certain types of interpersonal, moral responsibility practices and institutional practices like retribution, presuppose that individuals have free will and the required form of moral responsibility. And yet I would argue that, as you point out, philosophers disagree. This is a debate that's been waging for 2,000 years. There's no clear consensus. And it's not clear that we have libertarian free will or even compatibilist free will, or at least it's unclear that the kind of free will Dan thinks we have is enough to ground the kind of moral responsibility practices necessary. And so my conclusion would be that it lacks the high epistemic burden needed to justify these harmful practices. Now, Dan is going to disagree because he doesn't think these practices are harmful. He thinks the harm would be giving up these practices. But just to finish, my argument just very quickly would be these are not innocuous practices. These practices involve intentionally blaming, intentionally harming individuals, intentionally punishing individuals, sometimes to severe levels, especially if you're talking about public policy. And so the burden of proof falls on those that want to maintain the assumption that agents are free in the required sense. And so that kind of skepticism is a much weaker skepticism than my own personal skepticism. My own personal skepticism is that our best philosophical and scientific arguments give us reason for concluding we lack free will. It's the only rational position that we should adopt. The weaker skepticism here is that even if you don't agree with that, the burden of proof is on those that want to justify certain types of harmful practices on the assumption that agents deserve it. And if it's unclear that agents deserve it in the required sense, i.e., because it's unclear they have the kind of free will necessary to ground that kind of harm, those kinds of desert-based practices, then the default position is that we shouldn't intentionally harm agents on the assumption that they deserve it. There might be other justifications you can give for harming them, consequentialist justifications, but not the ones based on desert.
Okay, Dan.
First of all, I want to remind you of the important subtitle of my first book on free will, The Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting. I think the reason free will is a topic that electrifies students and can still get the attention of a lot of people is people think it matters, and it does. And it matters for the reasons that Gregg sort of started out with, namely, we want to know about responsibility and whether we deserve blame and praise and so forth. And as long as you stick to that, as long as you stick to the fact that that's the kind of free will that matters, then, first of all, libertarian free will doesn't matter at all, because having it wouldn't give you responsibility, not having it wouldn't take it away from you. Nobody's ever been able to show a good reason why. Let me back up on that. There's a better way of putting it. Look around us. We see people who manifestly do not have control of themselves. They have mental disorders. They've got brain damage. They, in one way or another, maybe they had terrible childhoods that have left them really in a bad way. They don't have free will. We have a nice, clear distinction between those people and the people who are in charge of themselves, who are in control of it, who can take responsibility. What we really want is for people to take responsibility. Now, one of the real unfortunate consequences of the free will skepticism line that Gregg and Parabon and others maintain is that it actually gives people encouragement to deny that anybody's ever really responsible. And haven't we, after 4 years of Trump, seen enough? We don't want Trump to say, oh, I'm not responsible for it. Nobody is ever responsible for anything. No, I don't want to live in a world where people behave like Trump. I want to live in a world where people take responsibility. And they take responsibility because there is a socially evolved and intelligently redesigned and communally established set of traditions and laws under which people are responsible and conditions under which they're not. And the conditions under which they're not responsible are not strange metaphysical conditions having to do with determinism or indeterminism. It's whether they can control themselves. And when you get out of control, then, right, you don't have responsibility. But you can be responsible for not going out of control. We're not responsible for being able to control ourselves in the first place. That's the luck of being born and having a more or less normal upbringing. But once you are a responsible agent, then you have a responsibility to maintain your autonomy and your self-control. And you can be criticized, not just criticized, but even punished for negligently relinquishing self-control, because the rest of us all depend on you maintaining your self-control. And I want to live in a world, a secure, non-failed state where people can go about their business freely and securely. They don't have to worry about being harmed by people, because people pretty well know how to control themselves, and they have good reasons to control themselves. Now, that world depends on the law, and it depends on punishment. Nobody has, not Gregg, not anybody has ever described a system which has laws and no punishment.
Well, okay.
Well, just Gregg, hang on one second, just to clarify. Dan, in your model, the assumption is that the person who has some level of control, some degrees of freedom, could have done otherwise, but he didn't. He didn't have to shoot the gun. He didn't have to drink the bottle of alcohol or take the drugs, but he did, and we're holding him responsible for making that decision because he could have done otherwise.
That's right. And there's a perfectly legitimate sense of could have done otherwise. Has nothing to do with determinism and indeterminism. Determinism doesn't show. Look, if determinism showed that we can never do otherwise, then what are we doing? Are we trying to persuade each other of something? It would be a pointless effort if it weren't a possibility that you could change your mind. Don't say, well, I could never do otherwise, because determinism is true. No. We look around, we see people changing all the time. Determinism does not tie our hands. It does not imprison us. It does not prevent us from turning over a new leaf. It does not prevent us from making better choices. All of those things are open in a very straightforward sense. And it's the one that we rely on when we make decisions about who's responsible under the law and who's responsible. When does a child grown into responsibility? Very small children, we don't hold them morally responsible for what they do. They grow into it. There's no magic moment where they suddenly have the moral competence. But we do have some bright lines that we draw from legal purposes, like you can't drive before you're 16 and you vote or drink or whatever. Those are arbitrary conventions. They might be changed for better or for worse. We could adjust them. But the idea that there's some metaphysical condition, free will, which depends crucially on whether or not determinism is true, that's just a fantasy. It's a philosophical fantasy that goes back to Democritus, and it's just time to abandon it.
Yeah, we're seeing
Yeah,
that.
if I could.
Yeah, go ahead, Greg. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there. I mean, there's some things I just want to clarify and sort of. I mean, one thing is that I want to make it clear, at least my free will skepticism, and I would say it's true of Dirk Pirabooms and Neil Levy's as well. We don't deny all forms of responsibility. We are very particular in that the kind of moral responsibility we're denying is what we call basic desert moral responsibility, i.e., the kind of responsibility that would make one truly deserving of praise and blame and punishment and reward. Now, I think in a purely backward-looking sense, but we come back to that. There are other senses. I
just asked for some clarification.
Yeah, but all right, let me come back to that though in a second, because I think that I just want to make it clear there are other notions of responsibility that remain totally intact. I mean, obviously, concepts like causal responsibility, and we use that kind of senses for even inanimate events, right? Like, Hurricane Katrina was causally responsible for the destruction of New Orleans, or the tree branch was causally responsible for the damage to the roof of my car when it broke. But there are other notions like attributability, where we attribute various traits and characteristics and even flaws to individuals, or even virtuous attributes. So we could attribute to Einstein ingenuity, some sort of creativity. We could attribute to Einstein various work habits and dedication and all of that, while still not thinking he is self-made and responsible for making himself into that kind of an agent. We could also, and this is the important one for me, engage in certain types of moral exchanges and moral practices where, moral protest is even justified. This is what Dirk Piraboo calls a kind of forward-looking form of moral responsibility, a conversational version, where we engage an agent in some kind of moral conversation, where we ask them to reflect upon the reasons for why they acted in that way. The agent might recognize some flaw in themselves that was the cause, greed maybe, or jealousy, for why they did what they did, and recognize and maybe acknowledge a desire to change that aspect moving forward, and lay out a sort of plan perhaps for how we could do that. That kind of responsibility, in my mind, can be justified on the skeptical perspective without any appeal to desert. Instead, it's grounded not in the notion of desert or basic desert, which is more important to me, but instead is grounded in three non-desert deseratum, i.e. future reconciliation, future safety, future moral formation. And in a lot of ways, I think Dan and I agree on a whole lot when it comes to those kind of practices. Where we disagree is on whether or not we're justified in preserving the desert system, and whether the desert system presupposes certain kinds of things. Now, I think that for me, and I'll be very clear how I define free will. Free will for me is the control and action required for basic desert moral responsibility. And basic desert moral responsibility is the kind of responsibility that would justify certain types of moral practices, judgments, attitudes like resentment, indignation, moral anger, blame, retributive punishment. And it would be one where the agent deserves these basic judgments, attitudes, practices, simply because they perform the action, not for any forward-looking reason. Now, Dan's view is giving us a forward-looking consequentialist justification for the system of desert. And within the system, things still retain backward-looking features. That's a much more complicated view. But I want to say that, at least in my reading of the literature, that's not the traditional compatibilist view. And second, I think there are reasons to challenge even Dan's perspective. One thing I would say is whether or not Dan's kind of consequentialist way of approaching it should seek to preserve the notion of desert at all. And that's because
Dan, why don't you jump in there?
Yeah. When he identifies this idea of basic moral desert, I think that's a red herring. There's no such thing banish it. It's not well defined.
Well, it's easy to define. It's well defined.
No,
I don't think it exists.
it is not. When you were talking about the kinds of dessert that, say, that Dirk allows, and you were talking about people who are open to moral improvement and conversation and all this. So let me just give you an example. We'll keep it nice and simple. You come up to Donald Trump and you say, you've committed all these crimes, and we really wish you would try to reform your character and improve and say you're sorry and all this. He says, no, thanks. Don't think I'm going to do that. That's the end of the line.
But I still think we could justify.
You do not think that the state has the right to coerce a criminal to pay for the advantages that they have taken that are violations of the laws of the land.
Sure, I do.
I don't think, because you think Donald Trump doesn't have basic moral responsibility. And I think he's got enough moral responsibility for us justifiably to imprisonment and to imprison him, to fine him, and for that matter, to sully his name and reputation.
I think that that's wrong in terms of what my view can do here. I mean, I do think. You tell me how far you can go with it. Let's use the example of Trump. All right, yeah, and let me say this. I of course I think the state has the right to coerce people and limit liberty. In particular, my analogy. Well, let me explain. I mean, my analogy with quarantine, right, is exactly that. The right to coercion and limiting of liberty and the restrictions are predicated on the right of self-defense and public safety. So the idea is that, look, we could coerce people to be quarantined, and we could coerce people to be quarantined by removing their liberty. And this is not a form of punishment in any intuitive sense. We don't punish the Ebola patient when we quarantine them, but we have the right to incapacitate them on the grounds that they pose a significant threat to public safety. And the argument would be, criminal acts that equally pose a significant threat to public safety can justify liberty-limiting restrictions and forms of state coercion on the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, analogous to the justification for quarantine. And you could do so without appealing to free will, retribution, basic desert, just deserts, moral responsibility. Of course, with someone like Trump, I think the idea is that if he were to hold public office again, that would be a significant threat. I think he should have been not only impeached, but there should have been a resolution barring him from ever holding public office again. And that could be justified on my model, because the restrictions on liberty would be justified on the principle of least restriction. Those are the least restrictive measures that are necessary to protect public safety. That is, prevent someone from holding a position in office again where they could do such damage. I, on the other hand, and this is maybe where we disagree, and you maybe just have more retributive impulses here than I do, I don't think imprisonment is necessarily warranted in this case, but I think that's just a matter of degree, not a matter of a difference in kind. So I think the idea for me is instead of ratcheting up our retributive reactions and our punitive reactions to white-collar crime so that they match the kinds of punishments we dole out for physical crimes, I think we should ratchet down the retributive and punitive reactions to both. And so I don't think Trump should get off easier than someone who's arrested with marijuana, or someone who failed to post bail, or someone who robbed a liquor store. In that, I think a lot of these crimes could be better dealt with less punitive measures. So instead of ratcheting them up, the white-collar crimes to match our reactions to blue-collar crimes, I think we should be ratcheting down them all. But I do have the tools necessary to justify restrictions and coercion. It's just a different type of coercion, not grounded in desert, but grounded in the right of self-defense.
Okay, so if I understand you right, Greg, Trump can just say, okay, I'll quarantine myself in Mar-a-Lago for the rest of my life, and I won't seek public office. You happy with that?
Well, I think that there might have to be other things. So, like, for example, well, tort law. I mean, tort law is not predicated on accountability in the same sense as criminal law. And there might be kinds of other crimes that he's committed. I'm almost certain that there are, in terms of tax evasion, in terms of contracts that have been broken, in terms of other dealings with the especially the state of New York.
Criminal law.
Well, what I'm saying is, like, so restitution might be required. There might be other penalties that are imposed. Again, if he refuses to pay the penalties, we could seize income, right, as a form of restitution. There are measures the state can take, right? But those measures can all be done in the same way that we currently conduct sort of tort law, in which case they don't need to be, again, predicated on the notion of criminal accountability, or in even this case, philosophical desert-based responsibility.
Well, I think you have a very naive and optimistic view of how this quarantine system of yours is going to work, as I've explained in the book.
I think
there's going to be coercion. You're going to have coercion, and you're going to have to have escalation clauses.
Sure. I'm okay with that, but I also very cautious about how they do it and what the justification is. So, for example,
look, I'm not calling for drawing and quartering people. After all, I'm saying we have to have a practical system of laws that will permit people to have the freedom of the state in the confidence and security that they won't be imposed on by citizens that just don't care. And so we have to arrange.
So I agree. I agree with this. And I mean, I think you accuse me of being naive. I accuse you of underestimating the tools that are available. I mean, part of me actually thinks you are a free will skeptic. And so in a lot of ways, the kinds of policies and kinds of justifications you give are ones that are open for skeptics to adopt, in the sense that, look, you deny basic desert. You deny that we're responsible in the standing before God sense. You deny that we're responsible in any ultimate sense. In a way, maybe the debate could end there, because free will skeptics could say that's exactly what we cared about in the first place.
They're still responsible enough to take responsibility, to be punished legitimately, and to be praised legitimately for their good deeds. There is a perfect good role for desert there. Namely, we only punish those that deserve punishment.
Let's say that there's two characters, Maya and Marina, and they each exist in a deterministic universe. Maya exists in deterministic universe A. Marina exists in deterministic universe B. And everything, the laws of nature have been set up such that everything in each universe is completely causally determined from the moment of the Big Bang on, such that in universe A, Maya robs a liquor store on her 21st birthday, and Marina gives $10,000 to a charity on her 21st birthday. But each did so deterministically. Now, if we could imagine a case where, the question obviously is whether or not any difference in treatment towards Maya and Marina would be justified on our accounts, right? So I'm a free will skeptic. I say no, that Maya and Marina, because their actions are determined in a way that not only their actions, right, but their inner psychological states, the reasons that came to them in that particular moment, the reasons that were most salient, that weighed most heavily on their deliberation, the habitual character that they developed, their constitutive nature, all of that, let's say, has been determined, right? Because that's what we're assuming when we're assuming determinism.
Because everything is determined, yes.
Right. So the idea is that the particular reasons that move Maya and the particular reasons that move Marina are the result of factors beyond their control, their psychological dispositions. And so the question is whether or not a difference in treatment would be licensed in terms of praise and blame, punishment and reward. I would argue no. Now, I would even argue, to help it make it clearer, for me, imagine a scenario where there were no forward-looking benefits to praising Marina and punishing Maya. That is, that the only justification we would give. Let's imagine it's sort of like the show The Good Place, where you get tally points right through your life, and then in the afterlife, you either go to the good place or the bad place. And let's assume there's no further moral development in the good place or the bad place. Can we justify a difference in treatment between Maya and Marina if they both lived in deterministic universes that were set up before they were born, from the moment of the Big Bang on, such that they were determined to either rob the liquor store or give to charity? All right, so I think this is where we disagree. At least we have a good intuition here, right? So my clarity for what matters in terms of basic desert is whether or not we could justify differences in treatment, resentment, indignation, moral anger, all the way up to retributive punishment and eternal damnation and reward, predicated on whether or not these individuals were free and responsible in the required sense. And I would argue, because they both existed in deterministic universes, they lacked the free will, i.e., for me, the control and action required. Now, not because they couldn't have done otherwise. I'm a source incompatibilist. So my reason for why they're not morally responsible in the required sense is because they're not the appropriate source of their actions in the right sense. That is, that for them to be the appropriate source, the action can't be causally determined by factors beyond their control.
Okay. The big mistake that I think you're making, Gregg, is you're confusing causation and control in the following way. Maya and Marina, you haven't told us what their upbringing was, how much self-control they have. Let's assume they're both very well self-controlled.
Yeah, they reach the plateau for you. They reach your plateau of
that's right. So the reason that they are both responsible, one for the good deed and one for the bad, is that they are both not sui generis, self-made, causa sui. That's a philosopher's fantasy. But because they're largely self-made. They've been making themselves for 20 years. They've been learning and practicing and growing and thinking and getting a moral education or not. And they've been exposed to arguments and reasons and consequences, and they've thought about it. Now, if one of them is just a complete amoralist and has no of morality at all, then that one is seriously defective in self-control. But we're not supposing that. So I would have first of all, I'd have no trouble saying that provided that Maya is a self-controlled, autonomous individual, not only is she liable for punishment and for being sent to prison for her crime, but she may well agree and say, right, I needed that. I broke the law. I'm sorry. I deserved that. I did deserve that. And she wouldn't be wrong.
So we assume hang on, Greg. So we assume in this example, Dan, that she could have done otherwise. Now, if we discover she had a brain tumor, or she had neural network damage or something, we would treat her differently.
And that's a very important point, because could have done otherwise has been inflated by philosophers into a bizarre feature which is of no relevance at all.
I mean, I just say this. I think I don't want to get into
the bizarre feature.
Yeah, I don't want to get into the
legitimate sense of could have done otherwise, where if you've got the degrees of freedom and if you've got the self-control, we can say you could have done otherwise. And what that means is you weren't tied up, you weren't damaged, you weren't deliberately misinformed about the case, you acted on the basis of reasons, you basically are a well-functioning individual. People in that state, there is a sense in which they can do otherwise than what they do. And
let me jump in with a real-world example, if I may.
Would determine it.
Yeah, if I may. So I get a lot of letters from prisoners because they don't have anything else to do, so they write me and ask for free stuff. And we send them magazines and books because I know the Christians and Muslims do the same thing. So, but that's beside the point. So one guy was writing me about we should do a special issue of Skeptic on abolishing the death penalty. Now, he was on death row. He had raped and murdered a bunch of women. And so I asked him, why'd you do that? And he explained, I don't really know. I just have these impulses that this is all I think about. When I see a woman, I just want to rape her and kill her. And he told me that after his conviction, and he's put on death row, I think this is in Massachusetts, actually, Dan, that he's in the van locked up to the seats with armed guards next to him, and they're driving him to the jail from the courthouse, and he sees a woman walking on the sidewalk, and he says, all I could think about is how can I get out of the cuffs, overcome the guards, and get to that woman and rape her. So he said, don't ever, ever let me out. This would be a disaster. So now, him, we might say, yeah, okay, so obviously he's got something wrong with his brain. Much like Charles Whitman, the University of Texas shooter that had the tumor, and so on. But, for me, those thoughts never enter my mind. It's not like I have those thoughts.
Those cases, and then say, we're all like that. No, we're not.
Right.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying, all right, so, okay. Couple of things. I mean, one thing is there's no denying, and I don't know of any skeptic that denies the kinds of distinction Dan makes between agents that are reasons responsive and agents that are non-reasons responsive, agents that approve of their own first order will and those that disapprove of their first order will, all the kind of compatibilist distinctions that have been made over the last 20 to 50 years. The question is whether or not those distinctions are enough to ground the kinds of more desert-based moral practices that we're debating. And I do think those distinctions matter. They matter in all kinds of important ways, but they matter for different reasons. They matter in terms of how we deal with them, what kind of rehabilitation would be most effective, what kinds of sanctions are warranted, but not because of assessing blame or desert. But let me say something.
But Greg, I think this is turning on what we mean by words. You keep using the word deserts. I don't think Dan is saying, in addition to not letting this guy out of jail, we should maybe torture him every week as punishment. Nothing like that.
Saying that. What Dan is saying is that the individual deserves to be punished. And
that individual is so damaged. That individual should be quarantined. I'll use your term.
Right. So
but that's because that individual doesn't have control of himself.
All right. So that's good. Yeah, fine.
But Greg, let me ask you this question. So if we take like a Bernie Madoff, he probably doesn't have a brain tumor. He probably doesn't have a horrific background. He's nothing like these damaged people. And should he not be punished for choosing to scam people in some sense?
I mean, my view is no, not in the traditional sense, not in the retributive sense. But I do think, sanctions and other measures are justified.
Well, again, it turns on these words. I mean, okay, we don't want to torture him, but he should pay these people back. He should never be let out.
Not words. These are really important distinctions between how the justifications are, what kinds of justifications are given for whatever measures one is proposing. Whether we ratchet them up or ratchet them down, the question is still how we're justifying them. I, in general, across the board, want to ratchet down punitive responses. Dan does too, I think. And so I would say the same thing I said about Donald Trump, in that instead of ratcheting up our punitive responses to white collar crime, so they measure, they correlate or match violent crime, we should be ratcheting them both down, because in many, many cases, I think better alternatives exist. With Bernie Madoff, clearly, things like taking away his ability to trade, and also in terms of restitution, again, in cases of liability and tort law and all kinds of other cases where we could justify repossessing his wealth, giving it back to the people he duped. All of that would be completely justified. And then maybe other measures. We have to look at the particulars. So without looking at particulars, it's hard to say exactly what measures. But the justification wouldn't be retributive. It also wouldn't be justified on desert or blame. It'd be justified on my model and other things. Let me go back, because I still want to be able to say something about this. Dan often makes this distinction between causation and control. But I do think that there's a little bit of a sleight of hand that's happening here, if I can. So what I would say is that we need to distinguish between two different loci of control. The kind of control that Dan cares about and that we're generally talking about is internal control, or what we might call agent control, which is essentially the kind of control compatibilists posit when they say the agent doesn't have to be free from determinism, they just have to cause their actions in the right kind of way. That is, they have to be caused by a certain set of psychological states, and maybe certain other conditions like responsiveness to reasons, etc. They have that kind of control, then they're in this category. But then there's this external control, where we worry about control by an external manipulator, an external agent who has intentions to manipulate the agent control. So there's these two different loci of control. Dan seems to be presupposing that the only real threat, or the only way that you could undermine agent control or internal control or compatibilist control is if causation was somehow turned into external control, where you had agents that were trying to intentionally manipulate agents. Dan doesn't think that the kind of Dan thinks that the kind of control that's required for free will can't be undermined by luck, can't be undermined by determinism. It generally can only be undermined when there are these external agents trying to control us with a different set of control within themselves. I would argue that that's simply begging the question in favor of the compatibilists. And we have all kinds of arguments against compatibilism to essentially show the kind of control Dan cares about. Let's just call it Dan control. The kind of control Dan counts about. There's still an open question about whether or not that kind of control is sufficient for holding agents responsible in the desert-based sense. And the reasons why we could say that there's an open question is because you could run all these arguments, the no forking paths argument, the consequence argument, the basic argument, the manipulation argument, to show that there are intuitive ways to threaten people's intuitions that individuals deserve to be blamed or praised or punished or rewarded in these cases, even when they have Dan control, even when they have compatibilist control.
Gregg, do you mean, if we can move away from punishment for just a minute and think, to me, you sound a little bit like Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein, like a behavioral economist tuning the knobs of incentives and punishments to nudge people to do the right thing and so forth. I'm talking
about this. In the book, we spent about 20 pages on the manipulation argument. And in the book, the main response that Dan gives to the manipulation argument is that these are not really threats because these are cases where they're external agents. In fact, I give examples where there's manipulation, or at least determination, in ways that may intuitively undermine moral responsibility, where there's no external agent that is intentionally seeking to manipulate. So my what is it called? The brain implant malfunctioning case I give, where this woman, let's call her Elizabeth, has a brain implant, not for purposes of manipulation, but maybe she is suffering from seizures or some sort of shaking, and this is implanted simply to help her in terms of controlling her tremors. But one day, this brain device malfunctions. And it causes in Elizabeth an egoistic desire to kill Bloom. Right? Now, Elizabeth, let's say, retains all of the compatibilist, she satisfies all the compatibilist conditions on free will, i.e., she has a desire to kill Bloom. She approves of her desire to kill Bloom. She's moderately reasons responsive. That is, if there were sufficient counterfactual reasons against killing Bloom that they weighed significantly in her decision, she would, in that particular case, not kill Bloom. She's sensitive to all kinds of other things. But in this case, the egoistic desire that tips the scales to kill Bloom is caused by a malfunctioning brain implant. Now, here's a case where we don't have an external agent who is intentionally manipulating Elizabeth. You're going to say no, false?
I said there's an external agent that plays a very big role in this, and that's the company that made the brain implant. They are liable for the malfunction, and their liability removes her responsibility.
But here's the challenge for the compatibilist, is that if those internal desires, let's say the egoistic desire that ultimately wins out and causes her to kill Bloom, is caused by the malfunctioning device, or it's caused by her upbringing, her prior experiences, factors going back before she was even born into the remote past. If they're caused, they're caused. And for the compatibilist, they're caused. Right? Mm-hmm. They're causally determined.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, they are, right? If you're assuming determinism. If you're not assuming determinism, then we're talking about something else, right?
Oh, I'm happy to, for the sake of this argument, I'll be an out-and-out card-carrying determinist. Yes.
Right. So the inner psychological states that causally determine Elizabeth to kill Bloom are what they are at time T1. Whether or not the way she got there was caused by a malfunctioning brain implant, or whether it's caused by an external set of neuroscientists, or whether it's caused by natural factors beyond her control. Now, I guess I know you're going to say that last case is different than the former, but what I'm arguing is that by talking about the distinction between control and causation, and you're begging the question because you're assuming that the only thing that could undermine that kind of responsibility is when there are external agents involved.
Well, I don't think I'm begging the question because I've been given good reasons why it's the control by other agents that matters.
But I could come up with examples where there's a natural...
Those are, if you like, political reasons. That is to say, we live in societies. We live in societies that have laws and that have other agents. And we have come to recognize that other agents play a disproportionate role in the behavior of our fellow human beings. And also, sometimes, because of their plans, desires, and projects, they interfere with the activities and control of other agents. That's what makes the cases different.
Well, let me give you a different case. This is not mine. This is Gunnar.
Up another thought experiment.
Yeah,
into it. You haven't given me one yet.
On this point, Greg. But Greg, before we get in another thought experiment, how would your model deal with, say, the degrees of murder? There's first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and so on. For our listeners, let me just go through them again, because the law has already kind of dealt with this. First-degree murder is the unlawful killing of one human being by another with malice aforethought. Second-degree murder, unlawful killing of one human by another without malice aforethought. Voluntary manslaughter, unlawful killing of one human being without prior intent to kill and is committed under circumstances that would cause a reasonable person to become emotionally or mentally disturbed, like in a crime of passion. And then involuntary manslaughter, like you accidentally hit somebody with a car and kill them. In your system, the law already kind of deals with this with different degrees of punishment and what we're going to how we're going to respond to that socially and legally. How would you change that, or how would your system handle that?
Yeah. So I have a whole nother book coming out that develops my whole model on this, but I'll give you the short answer. I think a lot of those distinctions can still are relevant, but they're relevant again in different ways. So let me give you an example where we could tease apart some of them. So let's say there's 3 mothers. Let's keep it 2 for the beginning. 2 mothers that are causally responsible for the death of their children. Both of the mothers left their child in a hot car, and the child died. Let's say the first mother did so with mens rea. She had a premeditated plan to murder her child. She wanted to do it in a way that maybe it looked like an accident so she could get away with it. So she set it up so that, she drove to the supermarket, left the child in a hot car, and the child dies. Mother 2, let's say, was up all night last night with the stomach flu, vomiting. She was sick, didn't get any sleep. She had a really important meeting this morning, dropped off her 2 oldest children at school, but the baby, the infant, fell asleep. She forgot to drop him off at daycare, goes into work, halfway through the day, forgets, runs out, discovers that the baby died in the car. My model says that, these distinctions are important, and they're important in particular ways, because the future threat that Mother A poses to her other children is significantly different than the future threat that Mother 2 poses to her children. Mother 2's, in this case, it might be involuntary manslaughter or some other thing that she's guilty of. But in my model, she doesn't pose the same significant threat to her other children because she lacked the guilty mind, the intention. This was a one-off accident. The other mother, assuming she has other children, assuming that she has certain kind of criminal tendencies that pose a threat to other members of society, we think we would justify incapacitation. Now let's add a third mother who also accidentally left her child in the car. But the difference between the 2 mothers that accidentally left the mother in the car has to do something about their habitual character. The third mother, let's say, is habitually negligent. She always forgets to pick up her children at school. There are numerous occasions where she's accidentally left the child in the car and they survived. This occasion is one in which the child didn't survive. She's significantly different than Mother 2. The Mother 2, who normally is very attentive, very responsive, a very caring, compassionate, and concerned parent, but in this particular case, due to the stomach flu, ended up having a really bad, really unfortunate brain fart, an oversight, right? Mother 3, and this is where my different accounts of responsibility are relevant. You could attribute different types of character traits to the different agents in all 3 of these cases. And that attributability responsibility is relevant because I would argue that Mother 3 is different than Mother 2 because she does pose a potential threat to her other 2 remaining children. If those children remain in the home, let's say, and she's habitually negligent. Now, I don't think incapacitation or jail would be warranted in the third case, but I do think maybe supervision or Child Protective Services getting involved or mandatory parenting or counseling, something in this case to assure the safety of those children. But I can account for exactly the distinctions the law accounts for between mens rea, intent, guilty mind, criminal act. Of course, criminal act matters. Actus reus matters because we want to make sure we hold the agents who are causally responsible. You don't want to incapacitate people who are not a threat to society in any fashion.
That sounds a lot like what Dan's been arguing. Dan?
No. Because the conceptual framework is significantly different. Causal responsibility here is not about assessing blame. It's saying that this is the agent that, look, you don't want to imprison me for the death of the child if I wasn't involved in any 3 of these cases. We all
obviously, Dan.
The one problem with Gregg's view, and this is something that we do go in the book. Again, we're in thought experiment land. Gregg's colleagues invent a pill which renders one no longer likely to commit a crime. And the first mother, the one that did it and deliberately tried to get away with murder, we catch her. She says, okay, I take the pill, gulp, thank you. Now, let me go about the rest of my life just fine. I'm no longer a threat to anybody. I did it on purpose. I did it deliberately. I did it with mens rea. But now that I've taken the pill, I'm not dangerous. So, of course, let me go.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I would say, I mean, I don't want to, I answer the question directly in the book and I just bite the bullet in that case. But what I would, yeah, I mean, what I would say, though, in addition, is that there might be all kinds of good moral reasons to oppose such a pill. There are clearly ethical concerns. There are questions about whether or not the pill changes individuals and one's deep self, if there is a deep self. So there's all these kind of reasons to be to say, okay, this is again thought experiment land. But in a way, my model does say, right, that the only grounds for incapacitating the individual is the future threat the individual poses. And in this hypothetical case, I think that, yeah, we wouldn't incapacitate the person. But I also want to add that if these hypothetical technologies become available, I think there will be all kinds of legitimate considerations that everyone on the spectrum, retributivist, non-retributivist, consequentialist, incapacitationist, are all going to have to grapple with in a very deep way, in the sense that, you know, if we could, in less invasive ways or in ways that respected autonomy and consent, if we could rehabilitate agents so that they're not any longer of a threat of recidivism or repeating violent crime, do we have the grounds for holding them? I do think there would need to be a whole rethinking of not only the justifications for punishment, but the length of punishment, the form of punishment, and whether or not imprisonment is justified. So I don't think it's as black and white in that case, even for the retributivist.
Just to be clear, Greg, Greg, to be clear on what you're objecting to. So, like these crazy stories from the Middle Ages when somebody killed somebody else with an axe, the guy got punished and the axe got punished. I mean, this is crazy. Obviously, we would all object to that. But you seem to be making the argument that even though humans are more complex than tools, we are kind of a machine that you could twist the dials to nudge in one direction or another direction in a deterministic way. Is that, and therefore no one should be punished for anything. It's not. Yeah.
This is another bugbear that I want to dispel, which is I agree completely with what Dan said much earlier in our conversation, which is people change their minds. People can be moved by arguments. In this sense, I think the compatibilists and I are on the same footing in that we both think that rational deliberation is consistent with determinism. No one, at least no one on this screen, I hope, thinks that determinism is a threat to rational deliberation. So in that regard, I think, look, the arguments you give, the reasons you give, the philosophical kind of cases you can give to change people's minds can change beliefs, and beliefs change, cause actions. I mean, reasons are causes, right? Reasons are causes, and you could affect an individual's actions by affecting their reasons for action. There's nothing inconsistent with that in being a determinist. There's nothing inconsistent in acknowledging that and denying free will.
Okay, let's stop there and let Greg. Let's stop there for a second. Let Dan respond to that argument. Those arguments you just made.
Greg, the issue about punishment is not the Kantian retributive desire to, even the eternal store in heaven or something like that. It's to maintain respect for the law. And you can't do that unless it's public, unless people have access to the knowledge they need. They have to know what the law is, and they have to know what the punishments are. Now, that says nothing about determinism or indeterminism. It simply says, if you want to have a well-functioning society, you have to have laws, and laws have to be respected. And laws will not be respected if they are too draconian, if the punishments are too severe, or if there are no punishments at all.
All right, can I say so?
And what you and Dirk and others keep trying to turn this into a metaphysical issue about determinism, where determinism, in fact, has simply nothing to do with the case. It doesn't matter whether determinism or indeterminism is true or false. What matters is whether Homo sapiens as a species has managed to come up with cultural inventions like systems of law and order, which are worth preserving and maintaining. I say the answer to that is obviously yes. That makes me a consequentialist believer in desert. It's because of the good consequences of having laws that are respected. That's why we have punishment. And people realize that because they are moved by reasons, they recognize that when they do something that's against the law, they deserve to be punished. And they accept that. They understand that they deserve to be punished. Now, the people that are not up to that, the people who are brain damaged and so forth, they don't deserve to be punished. We treat with something version of your quarantine model, but the others we treat, we give them the benefit of the doubt and we treat them as responsible agents. And for instance, the last thing I think we want to encourage is the medicalization of our system of punishment.
Yeah,
they took that in the Soviet Union,
which I don't do. That's again another.
Well,
so let me say, I got a couple of things I have to say.
You say quarantine, and I say prison.
Yeah,
Dan, Greg, hang on. Dan, what does the medicalization of prison or punishment mean?
You may remember an awful book by Carl Menninger called The Crime of Punishment, where the idea was we're going to get rid of punishment altogether, and we're just going to treat people, and we're going to cure them. Well, who says they're cured? Well, it may take the rest of their lives in the appropriate institution to determine whether or not they're cured, but it's not punishment. It's a cure. Well, the trouble is that Gregg's quarantine system, he recognizes this is a cliff he doesn't want to fall over, but I don't think he's put enough barriers up. And when he does put the barriers up, what he's going to have is a system of humane punishment.
Okay.
Not draconian punishment, not retributivist punishment, but humane punishment. And the violent criminals will be humanely punished, and the white-collar criminals will be humanely punished. And the white-collar criminals will have more punishment than they do now because they deserve more punishment, and they're getting away with a lot more than the others are.
Can I respond? There's so many things I have to say here, but one thing I would just say is there's so much more in the book because there's a lot of distinctions here that are being overlooked, and I don't want to make things more complicated for the listener, and that's why I think you got to read the book. But one thing, two things. First of all, you have to distinguish my own particular view, this public health quarantine model, and the different types of views that are available for free will skeptics. Okay. Free will skeptics can agree a lot with what Dan just said, i.e., in the need for punishment, the need for transparency in law, for everyone to understand the system, for a contractualist approach, all of that. And in fact, many free will skeptics, and the majority of free will skeptics, are consequentialist about punishment. And so one of the things I've repeatedly questioned Dan about is if Dan defends a view of punishment that's consistent with the same views that are held by free will skeptics, How is his view any different? And why does it need free will? And so one thing I would just say is, for the listeners, you could agree in part with some of Dan's criticisms of my own view. I think I have responses. But even if you did, that doesn't entail that we need to bring back free will and basic desert. And I think one thing is being confused here is that when we got off on the discussion of punishment is that we failed to distinguish between all the different types of justifications for punishment. There are retributivist justifications for punishment. There are consequentialist justifications for punishment. And there are mixed justifications for punishment. And Dan gives a version of a mixed account.
Yeah.
Yep. And so I think we need to be very clear, and we need to also be clear about what each of those forms of justification for punishment need and presuppose philosophically. Retributive punishment does presuppose free will and basic desert. Consequentialist justifications do not. Mixed accounts might retain some, and therefore we have to get into the weeds. So I think that instead of talking about the punishment, because I think that you could hold a consequentialist justification for punishment that's contractualist, you could hold a justification for punishment that's based on deterrence or future goods that are produced, and all of that's consistent with the rejection of free will. So there's absolutely no reason to have to be a compatibilist to defend what Dan wants to defend. The fact is, and what we've been avoiding, is that the thing that Dan wants to preserve that does tie us back to the free will issue is he wants to preserve the system of desert, the system of moral, not just punishment, because punishment could be preserved without desert. Punishment could be, well, Dan's saying no, but there are, just look at Jeremy Bentham. There are accounts of punishment that have been out there and developed, and I think there are arguments against them, but they're moral arguments. And so I reject those for different reasons, but not because they presuppose free will. They're perfectly coherent, and they are free of desert claims. At least they're free of any controversial desert claims. So what I want to know is Dan's defending a view that is, in my mind, very hard to distinguish from some of these varieties of consequentialist accounts of punishment that free will skeptics give. And the only thing that seems to separate it is the language of desert that Dan wants to preserve. And so what I want to know is exactly what that desert amounts to. And I think if it collapses to a very thin notion of desert, then in a way we're on the same side, and there's very little that separates Dan from the free will skeptic. If it's a robust notion of desert, then I think that there are significant philosophical issues at play. And then I do think it's a matter of whether or not which one of us you agree with wins the kind of debate over free will. But it all is about the kind of desert. I'm very clear about what my desert is and what it means. Dan agrees we don't have that kind of desert. Dan agrees that compatibilist control is not enough to preserve basic desert. And I see that as a victory. The next part of the argument is whether or not
let's let Dan reply to that.
Whether or not Dan
let's let Dan reply to that part. Yeah, sorry,
okay,
Greg.
But the next part is whether or not Dan's non-basic desert, what it amounts to, and how much of it is really true of desert.
Okay, Dan.
Well, this is the problem. Dirk Perboom and Gregg have this idea of basic moral desert. And I think that's a term for nothing. And in a way, they agree. They say, right, there is no such thing as basic moral desert. Yeah, but then there's still a notion of desert, and it's one that's familiar to all of us. When you say, I hope the better team wins because the better team will deserve to win. That's an everyday use of the word deserve. You deserve the first prize because you did better work than the others, or you deserve punishment because you promised to do X and you didn't do X. You had no good reason not to do X, so shame on you. You should be punished. This is an everyday notion of desert. That's the reason. That's the notion I'm using, and I think that the idea of basic moral desert is introduced precisely because if you think determinism is true, then you don't think there's any room for basic moral desert. So much the worse for basic moral desert. There's no such thing.
Okay, so I'll just say,
the kind of desert that matters is the everyday notion of desert, which I just gave you some examples of, which is strictly independent of both determinism and indeterminism.
yeah, so I would say, yeah, we also I keep on clarifying that it isn't determinism alone that's the threat for me. It's indeterminism and luck. And so I'll just keep on clarifying that we're not assuming determinism here. What I would say is Dan's notion of desert, the question or not is whether or not that notion of desert really requires free will, or whether or not it's controversial enough to be what has been of central philosophical and practical importance. So one reason why Peerboom and I define free will in terms of basic desert is that we think there's a couple really important benefits and also I think requirements in defining free will in this way. I mean, one, and this part Dan and I agree in, is it keeps free will tied to really important practical matters. So free will is the control and action that's required for a very particular kind of moral responsibility. I don't need to fight Dan on that because we both agree. But the other part is that the notion has to be of significant controversy enough to divide the traditional views. And the problem is Dan's watered down consequentialist notion is not one that most free will skeptics deny. And so it's unclear what kind of controversial form of free will he's seeking to preserve. The third thing I would say is that there is a real divide even among compatibilists. And I've had a lot of fun with this over the years. I've written posts about this, but I would like to write a paper entitled, "May the Real Compatibilist Please Stand Up." Because the compatibilist thesis has been stated by 1,000 different compatibilists, and it amounts to 1,000 different claims by each compatibilist. Many contemporary compatibilists are seeking to preserve basic desert. And many contemporary compatibilists think that we can make the kind of moral responsibility I'm denying consistent with the truths of determinism. Dan's not one of those. And so there's a new strand, which you might call an old strand. I think Dan is going back to an older version of compatibilism that may have been more prevalent before recent times, where people are giving forward-looking justifications for this backward-looking system of desert. In modern times, the only two well-known people I know that defend that view is Dan and Manuel Vargas. The vast majority of people like John Martin Fisher, like Susan Wolf, like David Shoemaker, Michael McKenna, all of these other compatibilists are seeking to preserve something I think that's more than what Dan is seeking to preserve. So one thing I'm unclear about, and we spent a lot of time on the book, is whether or not the thing that Dan wants to preserve is significant enough to really divide our views. If it's not, I'm happy to acquiesce to certain kinds of conceptions of gameplay and desert, right? Like I could say that when my daughter does something good, she deserves to be, rewarded. And when she does something bad, she deserves maybe to be scolded or have a privilege removed. But the forward-looking justification for that is that I want to form her into a kind of moral person that has good moral reasons for acting, and I want to affect those moral reasons. Those kinds of things are things that most free will skeptics think are non-problematic. What most compatibilists are, what a lot of, not all, but many compatibilists are seeking to preserve is something more than that. I think Susan Wolf calls it Italian blame, which I find insulting because I'm Italian. And David Shoemaker calls angry blame. He really wants to preserve angry blame. And so that is a kind of basic desert type of blame. that goes beyond what Dan wants to preserve. I think that notion is what has been of central philosophical and practical importance. And by shifting it over to something much weaker, I think Dan is unfortunately confusing the waters, because when you retain the language of desert, it's hard to, and Dan admits this in the book, it's hard to shave off all of these retributive and intrinsic good notions that have been attached to it over time. And so this is maybe just a pragmatic difference between our approaches, is about whether or not it's worth preserving certain terms. I'm happy with talking about degrees of autonomy. I'm happy talking about different degrees of control. I'm happy if we drop the language of free will and desert altogether and replaced it with different specific languages about different moral practices that we could then go through in a checklist saying, is this practice justified? Is this practice justified? And maybe the philosophical community would be better suited by just dropping these contentious notions, because I think that they're too loaded. They're
right,
too loaded with.
Let's let Dan jump in there. Okay, Greg, that's a lot. How do you want to parse that, Dan?
I think what Gregg has just said illustrates part of what the problem is. Because there's all these philosophers out there with different axes to grind and different brands of ism. And Gregg has just pointed out that there are self-styled compatibilists that have stronger claims that they want to defend than what I want. Too bad for them. I'm defending my view, which is the same view I've been defending, since 1983 when I wrote Elbow Room. And it seems to me it shouldn't be controversial. I don't want it to be controversial. It seems to me the only thing that's controversial about it is that a lot of philosophers and a lot of scientists have been conned into thinking that if determinism is true, they're not morally responsible. And that's just not true. I just want to block that. I say free will worth wanting, the kind that we should all want and want others to want and want to preserve, is a socially embodied, constructed, endorsed, relied upon set of practices and concepts. It includes a notion of desert. That notion includes sometimes joy and anger. Yes, it is understandable that people would be angry with somebody who they knows better than to do something. They do something wrong. They deserve not just our criticism, they deserve to be punished in the everyday sense of deserve. Not basic moral desert, whatever that is. That's a philosopher's only notion. It doesn't play any role in the law, and it doesn't play any role in the intuitions that support the policies we have about holding people responsible. In fact, if we think about responsibility, to me, perhaps the most important point about responsibility is that people can take responsibility. They can take responsibility. It is within their power. They have the moral competence to take responsibility. And if they are good folk, they do. And when they don't, and responsibility is attributed correctly to them, then their refusal to take responsibility is itself a moral failing. Now, all of this can be conducted independently of any discussion of determinism or indeterminism, or for that matter, luck.
Let me give you my own thought experiment. As a non-philosopher, I wrote my own thought experiment. Here it is. John Doe is an exceptionally moral person who's happily married to Jane Doe. The chances of John ever cheating on Jane is close to zero, but the odds are not zero because John is human. So let's say, for the sake of argument, John has a one-night stand when he's on the road, and Jane finds out. How does John account for his actions? Does he paste the standard deterministic explanation for human behavior, say something like this to Jane? Honey, my will is simply not of my own making. My thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which I am unaware and over which I exert no conscious control. I do not have the freedom you think I have. I could not have done otherwise. Could he even finish the sentence before the slap across his cheek comes from his wife's hand? Because of course he could have done otherwise. Now, if John is a serial philanderer, she should just divorce him because obviously he can't control it. But in most cases when these things happen, the assumption is you could have done otherwise, and you goddamn well better not do it again or else. And that punishment has to be sold such that John feels massive guilt and shame. He should feel it to his bones, and she should give it to him in a way like, you deserve to be really punished for this because I am so hurt. And in that sense, that's kind of our evolved emotions. There's a reason that we have those moral emotions, because you got to sell it. You can't deliver it in a way that's kind of a calculated behavioral economics. We're going to tune the dials to increase the incentives and so on. It's got to be real. So in Dan's example of Trump and the impeachment, the second impeachment, this was never going to happen. Everybody knew there was only 2 weeks to go. The whole point of it was a public punishment to other politicians. This is what we're going to do to you if you do something bad like this.
It reminds me of a real case of just a year or so ago where a judge, I think in Texas, let a juvenile off because the juvenile had been pampered too much.
Right.
He was a spoiled brat. Outrageously, the judge decided that this excused his inexcusable and negligent behavior. I don't know who it was who said it. Maybe you will recall this phrase. Some child-rearing expert said people are often told never strike a child in anger, to which the response was never strike a child except in anger.
Right. Yeah.
The cold, methodical, I'm not angry, I'm just providing a stimulus. That's not what we really want.
Can I say a couple things?
Go ahead, Greg. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a couple of things to say. I mean, one is I've been letting this slide, this could have done otherwise language, because I largely don't defend that kind of incompatibilism. But I'll just add, depends on how many things you want to hold still in terms of the hold fixed in terms of what we want to say, whether someone could have done otherwise. And so the way that we're using it here, we're holding certain things fixed, like the laws of nature and the remote past, but we're allowing variability in the counterfactual in terms of the inner psychological states. If we hold the inner psychological states fixed, then it becomes a different discussion. So I just want to be clear. I don't even want to get into that. The second thing, so it's unclear whether we could have done otherwise in the relevant sense. We could have done otherwise in a sense that we do use, and in the sense that we hold certain things fixed, but not other things fixed. The other thing I would say is I want to make sure I comment on this because it's come up a lot. I agree with Dan a lot about the social construction of our moral responsibility practices and how they evolved over time and the evolutionary account of these. But I also think a byproduct of that story is that they can change and they evolve, and they have evolved. We've evolved from societies that punished innocent people. We evolved from what are called honor cultures to individualistic cultures. And part of that, for me, opens up the hope that we could evolve our moral responsibility practices further in a way that relinquishes what I think of as outdated and unjustified, and in my mind, potentially harmful types of concepts like desert and just deserts and retribution. In terms of the case with the wife and the cheating, again, I want to reiterate that punishment is not the issue. A free will skeptic could justify punishing the husband if they're a consequentialist, if they're a deterrence-based theorist. And in that case, again, Dan's view is not unique and separate from the free will skeptic who's a consequentialist. So it's not about punishment. I don't personally want to preserve punishment, but a free will skeptic could. And you could preserve everything you said and still be a free will skeptic. The third thing I would say about that case is, for me, the wife can still justify leaving. And not, again, because she holds the person morally responsible in the basic sense, but because of self-protection. If the person has cheated on her in the past, and even if it were low probability, prior behavior is a good indication of future behavior, and I just want to isolate myself from a situation where I could be emotionally harmed again. And so all of that is justified, right? The guy could offer that excuse. It doesn't have to hold water, even on my account, okay? It doesn't have to hold water for the consequentialist who defends punishment on forward-looking grounds. And so what you want to preserve, I think, is retributive reactions. That does presuppose free will. Well, what Michael wants
well, only to sell it, so that he truly understands.
And one last thing. I agree with the evolutionary emotional reactions. And this is in philosophy sometimes called the reactive attitudes. And I agree that the reactive attitudes have probably emerged over time, evolutionarily speaking, for various reasons. But I also want to make sure that we distinguish between the naturalness of those emotional reactions and whether or not we should give those emotional actions justificatory force, i.e., use those emotional reactions to justify, say, public policies, to justify retributive punishment in the form of the legal context. Dan was just factually wrong before, where he says the law doesn't presuppose basic desert. I would argue it does when it tries to give retributive justifications for punishment, which require exactly the kind of desert I deny. You admit this, Dan. And that's why you reject retributivism.
Yes, and that's why I think that's why the law is not dependent on retributivism.
No, but in many states, ours included, part of the justification for punishment. In fact, the new model penal code doubles down on retributivism as the primary justification. I'll send you the passages.
Well, then let's fix them. I agree.
We're going to fix them. We're not going to fix them by holding on to the language of just deserts, because even your version of just deserts is giving cover, mistakenly, to those that use the same concept of just deserts to justify basic set of practices. And so one of the things I would argue, practically speaking, is that we are more allies than we are foes when it comes to reforming the criminal justice system. But I think you inadvertently leave too much on the field to satisfy the retributivist, because I think that the retributivist will appeal to the same common sense notions of basic desert and just deserts that you want to preserve to justify something you don't want to justify. And so maybe it'd be better off if we allied ourselves in terms of calling out what we both disagree with, focusing on that rather than focusing on trying to preserve something that I think gives equal cover to the enemy.
Well, you said that you agree with me that our systems of laws and morals, that these have evolved over time. Certainly they have. Nobody would want to live in a world of Old Testament morals today. We've come a long way from that, and it will come a long way again. Where we differ is that you think that the idea of punishment should go.
Retributive punishment. And for me, for moral reasons,
you keep putting that word retributive in. And I say, my view is that I have a consequentialist justification of punishment.
We have a mixed justification.
Punishment, it's not retributive. I know some philosophers use the term retribution and punishment as if they were synonyms. They are not.
Yeah, I would argue that you're.
So I think that your idea that it would be good to put our shoulder to the wheel and eliminate the concepts of responsibility, moral responsibility, and punishment from our practices. And I say, no. We want to keep both moral responsibility and punishment. What we want to get rid of is the fantasy of basic moral responsibility or basic moral desert and the concept of retributive punishment.
What is missing in the forward-looking account of responsibility, the conversational account of responsibility that, Pierreboom and I defend, that matters to you? And if you could accept the same kind of conversational model that we propose, then I don't know what separates us. The thing that separates us is that you want to hold on to those backward-looking features that must be doing some work.
They are.
Desert must be doing some significant justificatory work. Otherwise, it could drop out altogether and be a purely consequentialist theory. And by the way, I totally disagree with you that your theory is purely consequential. It's a mixed justification, and there are plenty of retributive mixed accounts that give forward-looking consequentialist reasons for preserving retributive practices.
Wait a minute. For preserving punishment.
No. If I define retributivism, I'm going to define it for you as saying that in the absence of excusing conditions, people that are incapable of being held accountable, wrongdoers morally deserve to be punished in proportion to their wrongdoing. That's what the retributivist wants to say.
Wait a minute. I thought we agreed that Kant's over-the-top retributivism, that's retributivism.
That's pure retributivism, but there's mixed retributivism. And mixed retributivism.
What makes it retributive?
The concept of the agent, the wrongdoer, deserving the punishment is doing something in justifying the practices. It has a justificatory role. Because consequentialist justifications of punishment justify the same forms of punishment, the same practices, without that desert. And so you want to retain the desert, and you want to retain that desert is doing real philosophical work. If it's not, let's just get rid of it. But if it is doing work, then your account is a mixed account. It's this two-staged account. Rawls offers an account like this. So does I'm forgetting his name. With his famous paper on punishment, Feinberg. It's a two-tiered type approach where you give a consequentialist justification for preserving retributive practices, not punishment practices, but practices that are justified on the grounds of desert, where wrongdoers deserve punishment in proportion to the wrongdoing.
What does punishment mean then?
Punishment is harsh treatment, right? So punishment, the consequentialist could justify harsh treatment for deterrence reasons without appealing to desert.
So much of this turns on just what we mean by these words. Cesare Beccarea's, Enlightenment improvement that the punishment should fit the crime. That was a huge step in, Western jurisprudence. Before that, it was capital punishment for everybody or torture for everybody. But Gregg, you seem to be objecting to that. The punishment should fit the crime. If not that, then what? Proportionality. Principle proportionality.
Yeah, I have to reject that proportionality principle because I reject the retributive version. I retain a different proportionality principle, which is that the individual sanctions or liberty-limiting restrictions should be in accordance with the future threat the individual poses, and so should be proportional to the threat.
This reminds me. Wait, I'll let you finish. Then you just reminded me of a disagreement we had in the book, which I think is really relevant right here. The account of harsh practices or punishment that isn't retributive that Gregg is defending here has one, I think, embarrassing consequence. It would justify umpires calling strikes when the pitcher threw balls if he thought the consequences for the pitcher would be better, rather than calling them as he sees them. My view of punishment says you have a consequentialist justification of the whole system of punishment, but then you leave consequences aside. You don't want the referee in the soccer game saying, it's going to hurt this guy's feelings so much if I give him a red card. Moreover, it'll mean that Milan won't go to the finals. No, that's completely out of bounds. You do not look at consequences when you are following the rules. Now, my account then of punishment is that we do not look at individual cases and treat them with consequentialist reasoning. We don't say, well, in this case, will it do more harm than good to punish this person? No, that undermines respect for the law. We have the rules and we have agreed to play by them. And if on occasion people get hurt in ways that are unfortunate, tough. They agreed to play the game. These are the rules. And they don't have any complaint because they did the infraction. I mean, you'd never have a soccer player saying to the referee, oh, but I couldn't do otherwise because determinism is true, so you can't give me a penalty. Preposterous.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I understand that of your theory. I think that's an improvement over pure. That's fine. Yeah. But the question I have is, again, how that differs. Because a consequentialist could say that too. A pure consequentialist, free of desert, could say that and say that the reason why the rules have to be enforced equally and transparently is because that produces the best overall outcome. If you muddy them up, if you play around with them internal to the practices, then abuses open up and all kinds of things occur. But the question I'm still having is when you mention your justification for punishment again, you're not bringing desert in. And I think you want to bring desert in, and that's why you think it's unique. That's why I call it a mixed account. If desert is doing nothing and could drop out completely, and we're left with purely consequentialist justifications of these practices, then I wonder why couldn't causal responsibility be the backward-looking feature that does the work for you? That is, Mother A was causally responsible for the death of the child. She needs to be sanctioned because she poses a different kind of threat moving forward. No, you want to say something significant about desert here. Yep. And that's why I'm calling you a mixed theorist, because that feature is doing some justificatory work other than the pure consequentialist theory is.
It's doing exactly the same consequentialist work as the referee giving the red card in the last 5 seconds of the game.
I think there's a difference between...
He's going to do it again. It said he broke the rules and he did it egregiously. And that's why he gets the red card.
And deserves the red card. Yeah.
He deserves a red card in that case. That's right.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, the sports analogy I always find hard because I think there's perfectly instrumentalist and practical reasons to enforce rules within games that I think the free will skeptic.
But society is like a game.
Yeah. Can make. Yes, there are similarities with games, like board games and sports, and there are dissimilarities. I think what Dan is trying to say is that game blame, let's call it game blame, when I blame the person who committed the foul that got the red card. That's the it's the same thing writ large in society. And I do think that there are similarities between board games and rules that are enforced within board games, and there are dissimilarities in that the kind of interpersonal, our interpersonal practices have a lot higher stake than game blame, and they could do a lot more harm. And I think they play different functions than they do. So, like,
that's why we have criminal penalties, not just red cards, because in society, more harm is being done.
Look,
and
I'm playing.
If you do something egregious enough in soccer, you'll go to jail.
Yeah. Well, all right. Let me give you an analogy. Downstairs before I came up, I'm playing Monopoly with my daughter and my wife, and my daughter lands on the go to jail box, and so I say, no, you got to go to jail, right? And literally, like in the game, go to jail, right? And so that kind of rule following that's a punishment. It harms her in the sense that it's a consequence she doesn't want to endure. It harms her in the context of the game, right? So you're intentionally harming someone in this way. But no one would see that that's involving anything, reaching any level of desert that's of significant philosophical interest to the free will debate. We could preserve that practice absolutely fine without preserving any kind of deep desert that is, I think, of any kind of philosophical significance in the debate that we're having about free will. Game blame or game rules in that context can be enforced without kind of condemnatory components that make punishment, and without certain kind of communicative functions that make interpersonal reactive attitudes significantly different than the enforcement of rules in games.
Actually, I disagree with you there, Greg. I think if you look closely, you will see that what you're calling game blame, and leave Monopoly aside for a moment, let's take, say, basketball or football. And there are penalties for deliberately rough play, for egregious fouls, and these carry moral opprobrium with them. They really do, and they should. And not just the championship may depend on it, the future salary of the player may depend on whether or not they get these punishments. And these are serious punishments. They're deserved. And my view, Greg, is that human society is the best game in town. We all want to play it because it sure beats living in the state of nature. And the penalties that society, I call it the moral agents club, the penalties that you agree to live by if you want to be a member, you agree. If you violate these principles, you are to blame and you will be punished. And this is bedrock. It is the cornerstone of a free and secure society, and it has nothing to do, again, with either luck or determinism.
Yeah, I think another real world example, in my sport of cycling, Lance Armstrong got, his career ended and so on for doping. And well, everybody was doping and so on. Yeah, but the rewards he got for the doping were far greater than anybody else got. And so the punishment should fit the crime in that sense. Now, he's no Bernie Madoff, but Bernie Madoff destroyed way more lives than Lance Armstrong hurt. And so, therefore, again, we're scaling up. The punishment should fit the crime, and so on. I wonder how you guys think about back to.
I mean, why can't we say, in a case like this, that, not only should he be stripped of those, because he was, right? He was stripped
of the 7 jerseys, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and the idea, all of that could be still, I think, accounted for on my account without resorting to purely backward-looking blame. In the sense that, in this case, the reason why we would be stripping him of his titles is that he won them by unfair advantage. It's a comparative kind of notion, in that we have rules, as Dan says, to the game, and if you play the game unfairly, that gives someone an unfair advantage, and we don't want to distribute titles to those who play the game unfairly. And so discovering that he was doping, can license us to restrict it. But the parts that are different, and again, I think my account.
Let me just add one little wrinkle to this, because it's actually worse. I mentioned that pretty much everybody was doping, and everybody he beat, they were doping. And so it seems like, well, maybe the best guy won anyway, since they were all doping. But the bigger problem is that everybody inside the sport, including the sporting organizations that were running and enforcing the rules, they knew what was going on. So the whole system is corrupt. And this is like a third world country that falls apart, right? So back to Dan's point, you really got to enforce those rules, because if you don't, then you get this spiral down where there's kind of a behavioral logic, a rational choice on the part of Lance. Well, the only way I'm ever going to win is if I do everything these other guys are doing and more. Well, that's, in a sense, yes, he's responsible, but it's also the society is responsible for letting the corruption even escalate to the point where everybody is violating the rules. Then you have no sport, which is why we got to have that rule of law. Anyway, so. And
I want to, sort of maybe end with, I agree with Dan. I think the idea for me, though, is that, you have to, enforce a certain sort of set of rules within the society. And there might be, rules that I enforce, let's say in parenting, keep it in an interpersonal context. And I might reward my daughter when she does good things, and I might take away her cell phone when she does bad things. The question that I still think is the more philosophically relevant question is not whether or not those practices would be justified, but the question about whether certain types of reactive attitudes would be justified, because those are the ones that are philosophically significant, right? Do I want to attach to my parenting when I punish my daughter by taking her cell phone away? Do I want, or am I justified in exhibiting resentment or indignation or moral anger? And I would argue that, look, if our moral practices are culturally evolved, which I agree they are, and that they are open to modification through philosophical reasoning and tinkering and all kinds of other interventions, these philosophical arguments that I and others provide can cause us to adopt certain kind of replacement attitudes for those few. There's only a few reactive attitudes that we think are unjustified. That is, the vast majority of our reactive practices would remain in place, whether skepticism is true or not true. The kinds of reactive attitudes that are problematic, the ones that presuppose free will, are things like resentment and indignation and moral anger. What I would argue is that many of those practices are suboptimal to begin with, and we would be better off adopting replacement attitudes. So instead of exhibiting moral anger at my daughter, maybe I could exhibit disappointment or sorrow. And that is consistent, let's say, with free will skepticism, because it doesn't presuppose basic desert. And it does exactly the same work in that interpersonal reaction. And in fact, it might be more effective. In many cases, I think moral anger and blame is corrosive to our interpersonal relationships and does more harm than good. So not only do I think it's not justified, I think we'd be better off in many cases replacing it. But I also want to make sure we distinguish between the natural reaction and whether or not that natural reaction is justified. There are plenty of things that evolution has hardwired us for that we wouldn't want to say are morally justified practices. So simply being natural doesn't justify it, right? We need, and I think Dan and I agree with this in the book, there has to be a philosophical case to be made to say that these practices are justified. So even if I'm not a Buddhist monk, even if I can't rid myself of these reactive attitudes, like if someone harmed me in an intimate personal relationship, I'm sure I'll feel resentment. But I could also, from a more rationally reflective perspective, disavow that emotional reaction in the sense that I don't give it any justificatory force in justifying certain types of things I would do beyond that immediate context.
Dan?
Well, the example, and this has got to be the last thing I have to go. We've been
going 2 hours. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, my last comment. Of course, with your daughter saying you're disappointed in her, much more powerful than being angry, much more useful. But that's when your daughter is 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. If she's 21 or 30, you're entitled. Not only are you entitled to be morally angry if she does something terrible, but you're justified in moral anger. I will return to our stalking horse here and say, I don't think that you want Americans to say to Donald Trump, we're so disappointed in you. Really. We expect so much more of you. You've really disappointed me today, this year, these last 4 years. No, we want to say, you crook, you cheat, you criminal.
What if Michael's right? What if Michael's right and he's a sociopath and not a member of the board? Are you gonna change your tune?
No, but it would be a signal to other politicians: don't do this.
How much control? Yes. And on that note, I'd like to take my leave of this discussion. It's been fun.
No, we've been going over 2 hours. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah. I just want to end by saying I have deep respect for Dan. I really enjoyed our exchange, both in the book and here. And I hope people read the book because there's a lot more in it.
Just Desserts. Check it out, everybody. All the details are in there. Dan, thank you. Greg, thank you.